Hello, everyone. Welcome. I think the other stream with Ricardo might have just finished a few minutes ago, so maybe we can give a couple minutes for people to transfer over or use the bathroom, get a drink, or anything they need to do. Hello. Hello from Arizona. Great. Yeah, so let me know when we should get started here. I'm completely fine waiting a couple minutes for people to join. So. Um, I was watching Ricardo's stream right now. I managed to catch a little bit at the end, and there was a lot of great stuff in there. So hopefully, I won't repeat too much of what he said in the first half of the of the stream, first part of the stream. Start at 12:05. Perfect. Sounds good. Oh, I should get some water since I'm going to be talking. We'll go back. Okay, so maybe we should get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's a pleasure to be a part of this festival, and I'd like to extend again a big hug to Corey, who, who I was saying yesterday. We keep running into each other for like 5 seconds every couple of years, and we have a major uh, jam session and coffee session pending for when we see each other again. We keep missing each other every time we try to arrange a meeting or anything like that. So yeah, it's been it's been kind of a funny few years in that. Yeah, there you go. Anyway, it's nice to be here with you. Um, I'm gonna focus my talk a little bit more on hopefully how to apply some of these flamenco techniques. Obviously, not directly as you would use them on flamenco guitar, but how to maybe apply them to classical guitar a little more. Um, I am a classical guitarist as well, and I just got my DMA in classical guitar here at the U of A, University of Arizona. Uh, so I've been using sort of I've been using a lot of elements from flamenco guitar when I play classical guitar, but more importantly, I think is what I haven't used or what I've sort of learned over the years doesn't really translate well into classical guitar, because an easy trap to fall on is to think that because you have really good rasgados in flamenco guitar that you're going to be able to play all the Spanish classical repertoire really well or a lot better or with some huge advantage over a really well trained classical player, which is not the case at all. In fact, I think a lot of people sort of go wrong with that. They sort of assume that because they have good rasgados, then they can play, the Turina sonata by Joaquin Turina, and it's going to sound great. And that's not really the case. Um, you kind of need a little bit more of a refined slash classically trained ear to be able to make all of those things work. So I'll give a few examples, and maybe Corey, could you let me know in the chat if Ricardo went over like the specific patterns for rasgados and stuff like that? Because usually what I do is I do a quick overview of the patterns, since a lot of classical players don't necessarily know all the sort of specific different patterns. They usually come across a couple during their studies. Um, but it's nice to have at least an idea of what all of them are sort of designed around, and then you can sort of choose which one fits your piece better. Um, he did. Okay, perfect. So I won't go over that again. um, yeah. So one of the things that I think sort of matter most when approaching uh, classical classical piece, um, with rasgados, is to not think of the rasgados as if you were playing flamenco guitar. And what I mean by that is it's great to develop the rasgado itself as if you were gonna play flamenco, or as if you had the sole intention of being a rasgado expert. Then yes, develop all of that facet of the rasgados. But then when you use it in the music, you always have to be thinking of the purpose of the rasgado in that specific piece or in that specific passage. So just because Joaquin Rodrigo wrote a rasgado somewhere in Concierto de Aranjuez or Sonata Jocosa or whatever, it doesn't mean that you should kind of go full out and do the Paco de Lucia version of the rasgado. Keep in mind that, I mean, I say that, but keep in mind that most of the best players in flamenco, they're actually quite subtle with things like rasgueado as well. It's not like they go crazy every time they do it. They do it to serve a purpose, and that's kind of the point that I'm trying to get across here. I think that applies even more when you're playing classical guitar or a classically oriented piece in general. Um, okay, yeah, I can do a little review of the patterns. So let's do that then. I'll do a quick review, just kind of glance over them just to give you the patterns, or maybe in fact I might do them different than what he does. So it's a good idea to just kind of go over them, and then after that, I'll just kind of talk about this more. This concept of borrowing the technique and the concept, but not necessarily exactly not necessarily exactly the pattern or the formula, but maybe learning how to tweak that a little bit. So, my guitar should be tuned hopefully close to A440, but I'm not going to really play any chords. I'm going to use the palm mute version of the guitar, which makes it a little bit easier to communicate this stuff. So, in flamenco, or the way I learned it, is that there's two main branches of rasgueados. There's rasgueados that use the thumb, and there's rasgueados that don't use the thumb. Now, I'm already lying to you because both of them, all rasgueados use the thumb really. But what that means is that some of them use the thumb as an anchor. Okay, so let's do those first because those are perhaps the ones that are least known to classical players or to non-flamenco players. So what that means is that the thumb becomes an anchor, as I was telling you, and that means you're gonna use that sort of a contact point with the guitar. Yeah. So for example, if I'm gonna do rasgueados on the first four strings, I would put my thumb on the fifth string. Yeah, just like that. And the concept of these rasgueados is to use the power of the sort of the snap of the finger. So if I did do it for you, maybe in this direction first, what I'm doing is I was taught that you sort of prepare the fingers on the palm of your hand, and then you sort of release them strongly from there, sort of as if you were like trying to flick something, right? If there was a bug in your guitar and you were trying to flick it away, it's the same concept. However, at least for me, it never worked to do it from the palm of the hand because that's really uncomfortable for me. I have seen some players who at least look like they're doing it like that, but if I do it like that, I have zero strength. My hand is just not built that way, I guess. So what I do instead is that I actually release them from the thumb. So for me, it's more of this motion. Obviously, I don't actually have the thumb like this, but when I prepare the hand, this is the basic motion that I'm using. And it's the same for all four fingers, right? And I don't know if you can hear in the stream, but hopefully you can tell that there's quite a bit of energy being released from the hand. I'll see if I can lower my camera a little. Maybe that's it. There's quite a bit of energy. There's quite a bit of strength that comes from this. So I'll tell you more about that in a bit. But that's something you want to really develop, and especially you want to develop it through the use of relaxed strength. You don't want to be like lifting the world with your fingers. It's more about just kind of learning how to release each finger very assertively so that it creates a very snappy and precise rhythmic sound, right? So something like that, for example. Oops. This is just my pinky, of course. Right? So notice a few things. First of all, we're not really looking for a sound like this. We're not really looking for an arpeggio or like a fast sort of brush. We're looking for a percussive sound, right? So almost if I was doing, something like that. Same idea, right? Not this or even that. We're really looking for that, right? So here's the basics. I'll tell you my basics, okay? So fingers sort of locked in the thumb. So when you put the thumb on, for example, the fifth string, as I was saying, my fingers, as you can see, are kind of locked in the thumb, yeah? And then you're going to release each one individually. Let's do the 5-note pattern first, or the 5... What is it? It's not beat because it's not 5 beats, but let's call it the 5-note pattern. So you do 1, 2, 3, and here's where the trick comes. When you release the index finger, you have to pull the rest of the fingers back into your hand. Yeah? Now the last one is finger retracts, and then hopefully you're back in starting position so you can keep going again, right? So I'll do it slowly again. Thumb on the fifth string, strings meter with the left hand, and then you go releasing from the thumb, you go pinky, A, middle, index back. From here, it looks like this. So I hope you're noticing a lot of little nuances when I'm doing this. First of all, if you pay attention to the sound, I'm not actually getting all the strings every time. I'm making sure to get a percussive sound, but I'm not necessarily making sure to get all the strings activated. So even if I was playing a chord like, I don't know, this, I'm not. You see, you can only really hear the full chord on the last 3 strokes. Yeah. So obviously, once you kind of go through the full motion, I'm doing it right now in slow motion, so it's a little bit harder to kind of to flow with the motion. But once you go through the full motion, you're gonna activate the full chord, so it's gonna give the impression that you're playing all the strings always. But that's not really what you're doing. What you're doing is you're kind of just aiming. You're kind of focusing on the motion of the fingers, right? You see, so you can kind of hear. I guess if I reduce the motion as much as possible, you'll hear it more clearly. It's a little bit like the top strings only get activated in the last few strokes, especially when the index comes back. But if I just kind of go through the motion, then you kind of hear all the notes anyway. Right? So there's a lot of kind of small nuances just to that technique. So before I forget, I'll tell you the rest of the patterns. That was the 5-note pattern, right? That's a quintillo or a quintuplets, right? So you're doing, per every beat, you're doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And one of the interesting aspects of that is that the first beat, which is in a way the strongest, falls in the weakest finger, right? You're doing 1 with the pinky, and then 2, 3, 4, 5 with the sort of strongest fingers in your hand. So it's important to practice it slowly because of that. That'll help you really develop a lot of strength in the pinky, which, as a side note, does strengthen the rest of your hand. The muscles are sort of wired in a way in which if you strengthen this finger, this one becomes stronger, and so on and so forth, right? So it's important to really work on everything as much as you can, even if you don't play classical / flamenco repertoire that requires a lot of rasgados. It's really good to include rasgados in your technique or in your practice in general, because it just kind of it works your hands sort of comprehensively, which is something that you really want. By the way, a lot of guitarists start doing rasgados on their left hand as well. I've seen, like, I think they put their fingers on the first string, and then they just like brush their strings upwards and stuff like that. So it's the same idea of working this side of the muscle as well as this side of the muscle, right? The sort of the extender as well as the one that makes you grip, right? So that's kind of an important concept to keep in mind. But anyway, here are the rest of the formulas. So that was the 5-note. You do pinky, A, M, I, and I, right? So for 4 notes, let me get this right. For 4 notes, you use 3 fingers. That's what's confusing about it. For 4 notes, you use 3 fingers, right? So you're gonna do A. Notice that when I do A, the pinky is also out. One huge mistake that I see sometimes is that when people try to do this pattern of just 4 notes, they lock the pinky as well, and then they try to just release A. But you can see even from this, if I lock all my fingers and release A, first of all, it's uncomfortable. I can feel like almost a sensation that resembles pain at this point, right? It's not quite pain, but it's kind of getting there. However, if I do this, you can see the amount of follow through that I get from the finger, and it's basically comfortable, right? So you never want to do this, okay? So pattern is A finger, M finger, and same thing, I finger and I finger, right? So A, M, I, okay? So if you apply it to the guitar, I'll do it this way first. You do A. If you notice, my pinky is already actually stretched out. You can kind of do it both ways. Kind of the important thing is that you stay as relaxed as possible. If, when I do this, even though I'm tensing my pinky a little bit, I'm still fairly relaxed. So that's That's not problematic. It would be problematic if your pinky is like completely stuck out and causing like already tension in your hand. You wouldn't want that. Okay, but anyway, if it's still relaxed, it can be here, it can be here, it can be here. It doesn't really matter as long as it's not causing tension in your hand. So again, thumb on the fifth string, and you're gonna release each finger individually in a very percussive fashion. So A, M, I, and then return with I. And again, A, M, I, I, A, M, I, right? So same thing here. So notice that, again, the weakest finger in this configuration is the one that has the strongest beat. So it's important to make it really clear. So for example, if I was playing, right, it's important to keep that first finger really, really clear in the pattern because that makes it extra sharp. And notice that, once again, I'm not really aiming to hit all the strings, right? I'm not going, which for some things you might want to do, but in general, if you're playing a solfa for a singer, they're not counting how many strings you're activating. They're counting the effect, the gesture, the strength, the emotion, right? So that's what you kind of focus on, right? You're not really thinking of, I better activate so that they understand the harmony. That's not really what you're doing. Again, there's obviously exceptions, but in general, I think this rule is going to get you better results and more effectiveness on your hand than if you're always concerned about activating every single string of the chord. Anyway, two more formulas with this no thumb area. So you have M and I, and you have A and I. I can't even do this. M and I and A and I are used for triplets. So, for example, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and it's exactly the same thing minus one finger. Of course, you're doing M and I, right? So M I I M I I M I I M I I. This one is probably the one that I use the least, actually, out of all of these. I worked in it quite a bit, but for me, A and I is a lot easier, to the point where I can do it on repeat for half an hour without getting tired. So I use that one instead, and it's the exact same thing except you're skipping the M finger, of course. Notice that when I release A, the M finger is also out, right? Because then that allows me to do the stroke with I and pull all the fingers back into my hand, right? So A, I, A, I, A, I. And I have noticed that a lot of guitarists kind of use this one as well. Because it's really easy to just kind of cycle it. Almost whatever you're doing, this one allows you to go super fast, super crisp, with pretty much no effort. But to develop the strength and the speed and the clarity, it's really important to work slowly, right? So ideally, you have a metronome just going completely straight, and you're going, putting a huge accent on the first note, stuff like that. It really sets you up for success when you practice that way. Okay. So again, same idea from this angle. A, I, A, I, A, I. And if you notice, when I'm going really fast, I'm not even really preparing anymore. But that's because obviously I've trained my hand so that even when I'm not preparing, the stroke is very assertive, is the word I like to use, because it's not that it's strong, it's not that it is punchy, it's just that it has a lot of direction in the right direction. So that creates a very percussive sound. So those four are the patterns for the rasgueados without thumb, which in parentheses, of course, means that the thumb is an anchor. It's not that there's no thumb, right? I'll show you now the ones I use with thumb, which is the ones that I think Ricardo was also mentioning towards the end of his lecture. he was giving some really good examples about Verdiales or something like that. I think he was mentioning, and it sounded great when he played it. So do whatever he was telling you to do. I'll give you the pattern I use just in case. I use P, A, and I. Okay, that's the one that's way better for me for some reason. I can do it, kind of effortlessly, which is the point that you want to get to if you're going to use any of these rasgados. The way you do it is very simple. The thing is that for these rasgados, the wrist plays a big aspect of the rasgado, because you don't want to be thinking individually, just like Ricardo was saying. You don't want to be thinking, in three separate motions once you're actually doing the rasgado. You want to do that when you're practicing, okay? You want to think thumb, A finger, I finger, right? You do want to do that when you're practicing, because you want each stroke to have just as much strength and clarity. And again, you'll notice it's not any of that, right? It's just almost like you're whacking something, right? Right? And you see, even though right now I'm exaggerating the motion of the finger so that it's very clear, really what's driving the motion is my wrist. I hope you're able to see that. So for example, when I do the thumb up, I'm not doing this, right? This would be sort of wristless, right? And you see the power of that, even though I've trained quite a bit and I have strong fingers and stuff, it sounds really weak. However, if I put my wrist into it, almost without even thinking about it, the sound is really sharp and percussive, right? So that's why involving the wrist is very important. So wrist up with thumb, and then I think of two sort of half motions, which is not really true. It's more like 70-30 or something like that. But you do one full motion up, and then let's call it half with the A finger, which is just the A finger in my case, and then I, right? So A finger half, and then the other half with I, and then you're set to restart the pattern again, right? So full, half, half, full, half, half, full, half, half, full, half, half, right? Another way to think about it is to sort of think of opening your hand, right? So you do stroke up with sort of a position of the hand where it's obviously relaxed and sort of closed, you could call it, and then you open the hand, and then you close the hand again, right? Sorry, it's kind of getting cut. So close hand, open hand, close hand, right? And again, same idea. Okay? This is the pattern that I use. And all you have to do is kind of practice very carefully, slowly, and slowly increase the speed. Etc. So one thing you want to avoid though is obviously what I just did now is an acelerando that I did in 5 seconds. That's not how you want to practice it. You want to practice it, for a good amount of time in whatever speed you're comfortable at. So let's say it's, this is the speed that works perfectly right now for your rasgado. You want to go, right? Notice that again, it's a pattern of triplets, and the first beat is the strongest one, right? Which in this case is a lot easier to do because it falls sort of in the strongest finger, right? In the thumb. Right? The other pattern, which I don't use, it's exactly the same idea, but the thumb is involved twice. So you open the rasgado with the thumb again, thumb, but then you use M and A down, and then you use the thumb down again. So thumb, M-A, thumb, thumb, M-A, thumb. Right? And same idea, you can speed it up. The thing for me is that my thumbnail almost always gets stuck. Is if I can do it, but it's just really uncomfortable. And for me, this one just works a lot better. So that's why I do the other version. And obviously there's one that you can call abanico, which is you're just kind of using all the fingers. So thumb up, and then all 4 fingers down one by one. Right? So if I do it slowly. And the idea with this one, at least as it was when I learned it, wasn't really to go, super, super clear with the sound. It's more to create like a bubble of sound, right? Like something more like that, rather than, obviously for my taste, it's nicer to understand what the rhythm is. So unless you're doing something like that, I usually stay away from that one as well. But it's important to develop all of them so that you have options when you find, a piece that needs rasgados or something like that. So those are all the formulas that I use for rasgueado. There's one more that really doesn't apply for classical guitar at all, which is alzapua. So that one is kind of a half. It's a hybrid between playing a line with the thumb and adding a rasgueado to it. But that's a very specific technique for flamenco guitar, and I can pretty much assume that it's never going to come up in a flamenco, in a classical Spanish classical piece, unless the composer plays flamenco guitar or something like that. There we go. All right. So, by the way, if there are any questions, let me know in the chat because I can address those specifically as well. But in general, as I was saying before, even if you practice all of these formulas and you master them and develop them to the highest level, even then, when you apply them to classical guitar, you want to be very mindful of how you do that. You don't want to just sort of throw them in there, because the sound of the classical guitar is very different from the sound of the flamenco guitar. And in fact, I would encourage you to think about it as much as possible as two completely different instruments. Obviously, they're both guitars, but aesthetically and musically, they're two completely different instruments. So it's a little bit of a mistake to just take elements from flamenco guitar or even from South American music. Actually, for example, Ginastera has a very famous sonata for guitar. I used to play that many years ago, and I learned some of the rhythms from South America to play that piece and stuff like that. But even if you apply those like just full on, it doesn't tend to sound exactly great. It's almost important to sort of refine the idea of the original technique or the rhythm in whatever instrument they come from to classical guitar, because in classical guitar, you're talking about the refinement of sound. That's one of the key elements that makes that instrument work and that music work. So if you sort of leave sound out the window and just focus on percussiveness and just focus on sharpness of sound, you tend to lose a lot of other aspects that really make the other instrument great. So that's sort of my overall recommendation and warning for classical players who are trying to use rasgueados and rasgueado patterns and stuff like that from flamenco, is to not overdo it. Actually, to go crazy when you practice and develop the clarity of sound and percussive clarity, but once you apply to the piece, only use what's necessary. The other side of that sort of warning that I usually give is to not overthink it, which sounds kind of strange, right? You wanna consider everything as much as you can, of course. I'm sort of a textbook overthinker as well, especially with classical guitar. But when it comes to rasgueados, I find that usually, like 99% of the time, whatever is the simplest solution you can find in terms of patterns is usually the most effective. So very rarely will I actually use one of the patterns that I showed you. Very, very rarely. And I mean, out of 10 pieces that I'll play with rasgueados, maybe one passage of one piece I'll play with one of those patterns. It's usually just up and down motion, actually. So this is actually a very strong tool. And in fact, in flamenco guitar, I play for dancers quite often, and probably this is the one I use the most as well. Whatever it is, you see, it's very sharp and very easy to control. Of course, every once in a while, if you're playing for dancers, but just to sort of get a very simple and reliable rhythm going up and down with the wrist is super effective. And the way you do that is just up with the thumb and down with either A, M, or both A and M at the same time. I think for me, it goes back and forth between going just P and M. So P and M, P, M, and P combined with A and M. Sorry, not combined with. P on one stroke and then A and M combined on the other stroke. Right? That's actually usually what makes it the easiest and the most effective. Aside from that, for example, I mentioned before Torino Sonata. I forget exactly what the chords are. It might actually be open. In this case, I do use a version of one of the patterns that I showed you before, and it's sort of a variation of A and I, right? So I is one that we use for triplets, right? So that's one that I use the most, as I was telling you. And for this type of formula, I basically use the exact same idea. The only thing is that I think I start on a different finger. Yeah, I start with I instead. So for example, instead of doing 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, I actually start beat 1 with the index going up. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So. Blah, 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 right? So that is the one formula that I use in classical guitar the most, because I can control it, and with this specific one, I can usually control also the amount of strings that I want to activate. So, for example, in this one, I forget what's actually written, but I think it's not all the strings. I think it's just the top 4 or the top 5. So, right, and that makes it so that you can really have a sharp percussive sound, but at the same time, a very sort of mild approach to rasgados. Because a lot of people start using, for example, which might sound good, just by itself, but when you put it in the context of a piece, an impressionistic piece, for example, like that one, sometimes is not as well received as one might think that it is, just because it sounds good maybe in a room. Sometimes it's not necessarily what the composer would have wanted, and that's always a priority in classical guitar. You want to hopefully be doing as much to enhance the ideas of the composer or to convey the ideas of the composer as you can, rather than, oh, I learned this cool technique, so let me use it all over the place, right? um, that's sort of my two overarching big recommendations for classical players who want to borrow flamenco techniques or want to, in specific rasgueado techniques, is do it with measure, do it with taste as much as you can. Don't just apply everything directly, because if you start doing that again, it's very very easy to go out of style very quickly. Just like Ricardo was saying with composition, in flamenco, you're not necessarily trying to reinvent the art. You're trying to come up with your own voice within the art, right? And it's a little bit like that with classical guitar. You're not trying to all of a sudden, sound like a flamenco guitar excerpt for a few seconds of the piece and then back to classical guitar. You're trying to make that sound hopefully uh, consistent with the rest of the piece, or even your program if you're playing a full concert. Um, so that's kind of in a nutshell why what I recommend in general for classical guitarists. Um, Obviously, there's classical guitarists who are very sort of naturally able to go back and forth between rasgados and sort of classical rasgados, I guess you could call it. Uh, but uh, in my taste, or in my experience, uh, even when I've seen players who I know for a fact, are really good flamenco players, or play Latin American music or other styles really well. Even when I've seen those players, the best ones tend to be very mindful of that sort of transition and that adaptation between the original idea of the instrument in its original form and how it's being applied to classical guitar. Um, that's something that really has sort of stuck with me through the years. And again, I think for sure the most successful performances I've seen are always somewhere in between. When I've seen performers who just kind of go flat out for the rasgado or the big gesture and stuff like that, it tends to be kind of a little too strong or a little too um, sort of in your face sort of thing. And again, that's usually not something you want in classical guitar. Um, but you could probably make the same case, for to go the other way around. Obviously, flamenco guitarists nowadays borrow a lot from classical guitar and all the school of training that there is in classical guitar, but they do that always while keeping sort of the main aspects and ideology of flamenco guitar paramount, right? That's what is at the forefront of their training. Then you add all the other stuff, but again, in classical guitar, because we're nowadays the level is so high, uh, even from a young age, that we're always trying to look for what's gonna give us an edge over the other 100 guys who can all still play like crazy. So I'm all in for learning from other musical cultures and stuff like that, as long as we're trying to keep the essence of classical guitar as much as possible. Um, and this is coming from someone who I think I became sort of properly proficient, I'll say, at flamenco guitar before I did classical guitar. So I had to really find that balance between things from flamenco guitar that could potentially enhance my classical playing, and things that would not enhance it, and maybe even detriment my classical playing. I remember I did some interview over the phone one time, and they asked me why how are you able to manage both styles or something like, or how are you um how do they benefit or something from each other, and I said actually what what makes it work for me is that I keep them very far apart. And they were shocked that I gave that answer. I think they were expecting me to say that fusion is the best thing in the world or something. But I'm actually a very anti-fusion musician. I like classical guitar a lot. I like flamenco guitar a lot. I like jazz players a lot. I like blues players. I like Brazilian music, but I hate fusion, especially when it's done badly. It's the worst thing. So I'm always trying to, I love to collaborate with other musics and stuff like that, but usually when I do that, I do it from the perspective of the classical guitar. I don't try to sort of pretend that I'm in the in that musical style, because then I'll just sound badly. Uh, so it kind of goes back to the same point of if you're gonna play classical guitar, don't stay away from, as much as you can, from doing like a hybrid mixture of flamenco sounding things with like a classical guitar portrait. If you're doing classical guitar, it's gotta sound classical, and it's gotta sound it's gotta have all the elements and aesthetics that classical guitar is supposed to have, even if you're doing a Spanish piece, right? Because it's really important to keep in mind that classical Spanish music is very, 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 very different in practically every way from flamenco guitar music or flamenco music in general. It's a completely different thing, almost as different as flamenco guitar and classical guitar, as I was saying before, is basically two different instruments. So just to think that I'm gonna play Sevillana by Turina the same way that I'm gonna play a Sevillanas by Paco de Lucia or somebody like that will be a huge mistake, because it's not at all the same musical intention, musical idea, musical purpose. It's just a completely different thing. It's almost like speaking two different languages, right? um, in fact, that can be a good analogy sometimes. If I obviously speak English with a sort of Spanish accent. um, on a good day, sometimes I don't have it, but most days I do. uh, and so that can create interest. It can obviously create a lot of confusion, as you're finding out. But it can create a lot of interest sometimes as well. Uh, However, if it's to the point where you can't understand what I'm saying, then it's obviously not good anymore. It's good to the point where maybe it creates a unique sound or something. Or for example, in this lecture, I can say rasgueado properly, right? Whether it's maybe somebody who only speaks English and has never had any contact with Spanish, they would say rasguada, or I don't know what, something like that. So it's great that I have the knowledge from another language to say rasgueado properly. But if I'm giving a lecture in English and my entire phraseology is in Spanish, then we won't understand anything, right? So that's a little bit the point I'm trying to make with classical guitar. If you're giving this whole concept of classical music, and all of a sudden you say you make a rhythmic gesture with a rasgueado that sounds like the proper thing, then great. But you want to be careful not to let that sort of overtake or overpower the essence of what you're doing in the language that you're actually doing, right? In that case, classical guitar or classical music. Um, that's why my my usual initial reaction to including flamenco things in classical guitar is careful. Even though I think it's great, I think it should be done as tastefully as possible and as carefully as possible. Because to me, again, that's the only way that it really enhances classical guitar and its music. And by that I mean, of course, Spanish classical guitar. Obviously, there's some Latin American music that also allows for the use of rasgueados and things like that. But more to the point, there, for example, me being a flamenco player as well, if I'm playing a piece by Latin American composer Piazzolla or Ginastera or something like that, uh, I'm not going to use rasgueados in the same way that I use them in flamenco at all. Even though I'm going also for a percussive sound or clarity and stuff like that, you don't want to just again throw the package in there and see what happens, right? Or just settle for saying, oh well, I know what it's supposed to sound like in that culture, so therefore it applies to this one. You want to be super careful, right? Because that's what ultimately makes music good, when you can make it sound uh, sort of how it's supposed to sound like, right? And what the intention was supposed to be. Again, the main purpose of classical guitar is to convey the idea of the composer. And if the composer in this case is Piazzolla, um, even though he's not technically a classical composer, when you're playing it through classical guitar, you should sort of be as respectful as possible of Piazzolla, right? That's sort of what I'm trying to get at. Anyway, I've been talking nonstop for 50 minutes, I think 45 minutes. Let me know if there's questions. You can tell me in the chat. Otherwise, I'd be happy to maybe review a few things, and I don't want to kill you with my voice. uh, Even I'm starting to get annoyed by my voice now. Yeah, but that's the main idea of my approach to classical guitar through flamenco. Okay, or through flamenco techniques, I should say. Um, Usually, whatever whatever piece I've encountered in my career, or even in concerts, as I was explaining from other players, the the more level of subtlety you encounter, the best the result. Um, it's just a lot more effective to do it that way, I think. I see a question here. Well, I see a couple of things. Green Mountain Farms asks, "What is your method for composing?" Ah, okay, yeah, that's a good one. And then Prash shows the difference between the attack of the right hand and flamenco versus classical. Okay, um, I'll do. Okay, I'll do maybe, since we're talking still about rasgados, I'll do maybe the second question. It's kind of the same. It's kind of the same thing. I mean, as I was saying, once you obviously do want the the sound of the rasgado, and that's why we would learn rasgados right separately. You want it to be sharp. You want it to be concise. So, for example, if that's what is that? The sonata jocosa de Joaquín Rodrigo. If you notice, so it's the same. It's the same idea as when I was showing you the flamenco technique, right? So that is a little bit of maybe an exception where you can kind of just use that technique as is from flamenco. But if you notice, I'm using kind of a reduced version of it, right? I'm not right. I'm just kind of activating exactly the strings that I need to activate. And one of the reasons that I do that particular pattern there instead of, you see this one, when I use the whole hand, it sounds okay, but it's starting to get sort of on the aggressive side. So that's why I usually tend to do a more sort of light approach with the pattern that I choose, because I still want it to be aesthetically consistent with the rest of the piece, right? The attack for right hand is probably one of the biggest differences between classical and flamenco guitar in general, right? So if you're doing just an arpeggio, for example, in classical guitar, for me in specific, the one of the biggest differences is the thumb. So in flamenco guitar, when I use the thumb, I use the flesh of the thumb to activate the string. In fact, I have a callus and I have even some super glue there right now. It looks disgusting, but that's because I use the flesh in combination with the string, with the nail. Sorry, right? For example, in flamenco, it's very common to use the thumb along with the wrist for a motion like that, right? Or alzapua, like I was saying before. That's probably the biggest difference, aside from rasgados and stuff like that, that you'll encounter between both techniques, because it's a very, very aggressive attack compared to flamenco, to classical guitar. In classical guitar, I use only my nail usually. So even if I'm gonna play a very strong line, only the nail. In flamenco, I use the flesh as well. And as you can see, when I play classical, it's just the thumb that I'm using. Everything is activated from there. Right? But when I use flamenco, or when I do flamenco, sorry, I use almost the entire wrist, right? If I was playing the same line, right, I'm using the weight of the hand almost to do that, and that allows for a sharper sound that sort of cuts through a little. It cuts through a little bit clearer, perhaps, than something. The sound is perhaps a little more defined when I play just with the nail, but there's a lot more power and intensity to the sound when I play with the whole wrist, of course. Right, and so this whole technique is derived from very old school players who used to play for singing all the time, or even for dancing, who played most of their melodies with the thumb. So, and you would keep it. For example, if you're playing bulería or something, right? You want something that's really simple, really strong, and really clear, so that everybody can sort of understand and get the idea clearly, right? Um, That's why the thumb technique is really important in flamenco guitar. Obviously, nowadays you can do all sorts of things with the technique as developed as it is, um, but that's sort of where it comes from. So that's why there's a big difference between classical thumb and classic and flamenco thumb, right? As for the other fingers, um, there's not a lot of difference in essence, but there is a difference in attack because in flamenco guitar you're always concerned about the sharpness of sound again, the clarity of the sound, and the snap of the note, right? You're not really concerned about the purity of sound. I have to say though, nowadays most of the sort of top players in flamenco do have a very refined sound. It's not as refined or as warm or as um, I don't know, round as a classical player sound, but it is a lot more refined than a flamenco player sound would have been 50 years ago. Even somebody like Sabicas already had a very evolved concept of sound. Um, very famously, Vicente Amigo, for example, has a very nice, sweet sound, and it's just most players now do have a little bit more of a sweeter sound than perhaps they used to have 50 years ago. So I was saying. Um, However, even the top flamenco guitarists today will have a sharper, brighter sound than most classical guitarists today. Um, Probably all, and with good reason. Again, the purpose of the guitar in both genres is completely different, right? So that's why sometimes in flamenco you'll see a bit of a sharper attack, perhaps more. Perhaps it's easier to see it this way, a little bit more cutting across the string rather than along the string. Uh, Obviously, in classical guitar, you look for an angle so that you can slide through the nail and have sort of a nice round sound. My nails are not set up for that right now. You look for a very round, warm tone with no noise from the string whatsoever. You try to eliminate all of that as much as possible. In flamenco, that's not really the priority. Again, it's just the purity of sound, like the purity of the rhythm, right? Right? That's kind of what you're looking for. You wouldn't really ever look for that type of sound on classical guitar. Obviously, you use color in classical guitar all the time, but that even that is quite different than flamenco guitar. Uh, so the main difference really is the thumb. There's some difference in the attack of the. I think probably in flamenco guitar you use a lot more rest stroke than you use in classical guitar, especially for scales and stuff like that. Almost never you play a scale with just tirando. Usually you're using apoyando, right? Or rest stroke. But it really depends on the player as well. Pepe Romero plays apoyando all the time. David Russell very rarely plays scales apoyando. He plays tirando. I have to say though, I mean that's kind of a personal thing because even though David Russell, for example, doesn't use uh, apoyando scales all the time, he does have an apoyando sound anyway. So it's at that point it really is kind of preference, I would think. Um, for me personally, when I play classical guitar, I stay away from the rest strokes. From the rest strokes. You see, there's my accent again. I stay away from the rest stroke because, in my case, it's a little bit too heavy for classical guitar, especially if I'm playing something like Bach or Renaissance music or something like that. Even uh, classical music from the classical period. I mean, I tend to not use a lot of rest strokes. I use rest strokes obviously in every piece, but I don't use as many rest strokes in a piece by Bach as I do in a piece by Joaquin Rodrigo, for example. Very very different concepts. Um, Also because of the attack and stuff like that, and that's one of the ways in which I make it work for me to be able to still play both styles. Hopefully well without starting to mix them both into one weird amalgamation of guitar, right? I keep sort of the sharper sounding items on my hand, especially my right hand, to flamenco guitar, and I keep sort of a more refined approach for classical guitar that use a lot of tirando. I have the term in Spanish now. Free stroke. There. Um, that's the way that I make it work, and I would recommend an approach like that if you're practicing both styles as well. Um, those are the main differences for me anyway when it comes to attack on the right hand. But I will say this: the most important thing is to train your ear. So if your ear knows what the music is supposed to sound like, or has a very clear concept of what you want it to sound like, then your hand will find a way. But it's really difficult to do that if you don't know what the music is supposed to sound like. So it's a little bit again like learning a language, even though it's a bit of a stretch. But if you that's why if you move to a country, you never spoken French before, and you learn it, in Mexico, you're only going to get as good as what you think French is supposed to sound like. However, if you move to France and you hear every day and you hear all the nuances and stuff, you're going to pick it up way quicker, and you're going to be way more effective when you speak it, because you're going to know what it's supposed to sound like. It's the exact same thing for this specific case of attack of classical guitar versus flamenco guitar. If you know what's a flamenco guitar, or if you know what sound you want to have in flamenco guitar versus classical guitar, it's gonna already give you a huge advantage, because you're gonna know what you're looking for, and you're gonna be able to correct, the shape of your nail, the attack of the way you approach the string and stuff, because you're looking for a specific product. Um, One of the problems is that a lot of players start playing both styles without a definition, or without a clear concept of what they want out of each one of them, and that does become problematic, because again you kind of start to sound like you're doing both at the same time, which is something you don't really want, um, in general. But definitely, if you're trying to play like classical guitar at a high level, or flamenco guitar at a high level, if you have those types of traits just kind of mixed in from both styles, it'll reduce a lot the level of authenticity of your playing in either style. I hope that wasn't too confusing. It's kind of a tricky subject to talk about. Um, as for composing for flamenco guitar, um, it's obviously different than the process that you would use for composing in classical guitar. I don't compose classical music. Um, I leave that to the pros, to the experts. Um, in flamenco guitar, though, it is important to learn how to come up with your own music, because it gets to a point where when you're learning flamenco guitar, I think it's great to play music by other guitarists. I think it's the best possible way to learn, and I did my share of playing Paco's music, Vicente's music, literally anybody's music that I could get my hands on. Gerardo Nunez, I played a lot of his pieces. Um, this was many years ago, 20 years ago or something like that. When I was learning, I was just learning as much as I could. And in fact, when I finally got a chance to study in Spain, first thing I did was, or first thing my teacher there, Oscar Herrero, recommended, was that I just went through a bunch of music from Niño Ricardo, Sabicas, Esteban de Sanlúcar, all these people who've been like the pillars of flamenco, not only because you're learning about the form and the style, but also because you're understanding their technique a little bit better, and you're kind of just learning from the source at that point. So that's and at that point, that's exactly how people in Spain learn as well. Somebody comes up with a falseta or something, and they teach it to the next guy, and so on and so on and so on, right? So that's a really important process to go to before you start composing. That'll really enable you to distinguish what sounds authentic, or what sounds flamenco, and what doesn't. Because that's a really really hard line to sort of to find. A lot of times, and I'm sure, I in my early stages, this happened to me as well. I feel like it still happens to me. I'll come up with something and it doesn't really sound. It might be a cool sounding lick for guitar, or for kind of world music, but it's not exactly great sounding for flamenco. And at that point, it's best to just leave it, because when you start just um, forcing sort of foreign sounds into flamenco, you got to be really careful that it still sounds like in essence like flamenco. And flamenco is a music, in my opinion, that is receptive of other musics. And the best example of that is Paco Lucia, who completely revolutionized the language of flamenco guitar every CD that he put out, basically. Um, but he obviously knew all of the essence of the art form, all of the rules, all of the guidelines, right? Innate guidelines that you can't really learn from in a book. Uh, he knew him so well that he was able to extrapolate things from other musics into flamenco and make it sound good, and make it not only add but sort of enhance the art, right? That's where you want to get that. That's where you, again, that's how you create in flamenco. You don't really reinvent the art form, right? You sort of you sort of you sort of borrow things from other arts, and you supplement what is already there. Ida y Vuelta is a little bit different because Ida y Vuelta, something like the Guajira I played yesterday, it's Cuban influenced, right? Or perhaps even Cuban created. There's a lot of there, Colombianas, Vidalitas, Guajiras. Um, there's even rumbas today, for example, are played a lot more often with a Latin element. It almost sounds like Latin music sometimes when they play it, but there's a difference, of course, between a sort of a rumba in Latin America than it is rumba in Spain, a rumba gitana, right? There's a big difference. So those styles were kind of created from the amalgamation of of flamenco with these Latin American rhythms or styles that that gypsies would hear in Latin America and then bring back, right? Um, but when you're playing a soleá, for example, if you're playing a soleá, you don't want it to sound like a blues soleá or something like that. You don't want it to sound like a, I don't know, samba argentina por soleá or something like that. You don't want that. You want a soleá, right? Now within that you can be creative, you can explore, you can propose ideas, uh, but it does have to follow some kind of structure. Maybe structure is the wrong word, but sort of a language that's understood within flamenco, because otherwise it just starts to sound like something else. Even if you have the beat of soleá, uh, even if your metric is perfect, it won't sound like soleá because it's not using the elements that make it a soleá. I know this is very confusing and it sounds almost eclectic, but that's why it's so hard to do well, because it's not something that you can just kind of communicate uh, clearly. It's something that you have to sort of develop from many years of experience and listening to flamenco, um, especially to flamenco singing and flamenco dancing. I think that's what really drives home what's important in flamenco guitar. Because we have to keep in mind that flamenco guitar was originally an accompaniment instrument, purely an accompaniment instrument. And nowadays, we see flamenco guitars are amazing and they play stuff that is super complex, but it can all be traced back one way or another to singing and to dancing. Um, so that's in my opinion, that's one of the most important things to sort of get clear about flamenco. And then when you compose, you're sort of using those building blocks that are already there, and you're finding your own twist, right? You're finding your own idea. Um, Aside from that, it's kind of hard to sort of come up with guidelines as to how to compose in flamenco. Some people compose. For example, Ricardo was talking about how Gerardo, was saying come up with a chord progression, then start to ornament it, um, and then you come up with something like that. I think that's a great idea if you're starting to compose. Um, However, I think it gets to a point where you maybe have to do the opposite, because that formula, it can start to sort of box you, where you're kind of doing the same rhythms over and over, and that's something that I try to stay away from as much as I can. Not doing the typical rhythm of alegrías, 50 times in alegrías. Um, I'm always when I compose now, when I try to come up with ideas now, I try to come up first with a nice melodic line or some nice idea before I start to put it into a falseta. Uh, I do like the idea of coming up with a chord progression though, if because sometimes you can come up with something that's in between a falseta and variation type of thing, which leads to a lot of musical opportunities in pieces in flamenco guitar pieces. So I do like that idea quite a bit. But I will say that, for example, as I was saying, I play for dancers almost every weekend and for singers. Uh, that's a very fortunate position to be in, because that means that I'm being reinforced all of those things all the time. So I can sort of, I'll say that I can afford to compose in a different direction, because all of those other elements that you have to always have in mind are always in my mind because of that stuff. Um, However, if I didn't have that, as often as I do, I would probably come up, sort of prioritize different things when I compose. But nowadays, for example, some of the pieces that you heard yesterday in the concert are derived from an original idea that I composed for a baile piece, for a piece for dance, or for a singer, or something like that. So when they come from that, if they worked, then you can kind of assume that they're going to work on flamenco guitar, because that means that they were clear, that the structure was clear. It means that the resolutions were clear. It means that the language in general was clear. For flamenco guitar, you have to develop it a little bit more. At least in my taste, I think flamenco guitar at its best right now is not just a combination of falsetas. It's not just you know 5 random falsetas that have nothing to do with each other and that you just come up with at different times, and then you throw them together into a buleria, and that's a buleria. I feel like nowadays, when you hear really, really good flamenco guitar, there's a concept that goes throughout the piece. Maybe there's a refrain that comes back a few times. There's a different level of composition now going on. But most of the guys who do it, or I would say probably all of the guys who do it really well at that level, have that language of the falseta, the resolution, the llamada, the remate and stuff. They have all that language completely ingrained into their brain. So even when they're doing a super fancy version of that, it's still you can still somehow break it down into that, right? For example, compás, right? You one of the key elements of flamenco is compás, is the beat count for each different style. You'll see a lot of players nowadays, and I love to do that as well, who are constantly playing with the rhythm, or not coming up with rhythms that are not obvious, but the underlying rhythm is always the same, and the underlying rhythm always has to be clear, right? So that's perhaps a good example. Whereas maybe in the olden days you would have whatever falseta you came up with, or whatever line you came up with, would have followed all of those structures like piece by piece, and it would have been maybe a rhythmic sort of literal copy of the underlying rhythm. Nowadays, you're kind of expected to know the underlying rhythm and come up with a cool, fancy, funky thing on top of that, right? So that's again another very confusing cloud of words I just said, but as I said, it's kind of difficult to really. It's a little bit like for dancers as well. Dancers are also supposed to come up with their own stuff, and it's not really the case for singers though. Singers could make an entire career out of just singing letters that have been sung for 50 years, as I was saying, and do that really, really well. That is not a problem at all. Obviously, most of the top singers today come up with new lyrics all the time, or even have people who write lyrics for them, and then they put the music to them and stuff like that. But they could afford to just sing soleadas as it's textbook Soleada de Alcalá, or Soleada de Cádiz, Soleada de Triana, for the rest of their lives, and be completely successful. In guitar, I think at some point you would be expected to play your own stuff, even unless you were a purely accompanist level guitarist, or not level, accompanist driven guitarist, and you were you kept sort of the same falsettos all the time. But even then, somebody like Moraito Chico or Paco de Lucia, even when they were in completely accompanist fashion, they still come up with their own stuff, and that's what made them so great. So I think it's the same for dancers. Dancers, you learn all the steps from a teacher, from friends, colleagues, family, whatnot. But once you get to that upper echelon of of dancing, especially of solo dancing, or have your company and stuff, you're kind of expected to come up with your own stuff. You're not. You might use a variation of a step here and there of somebody else, or you might take an idea from someone, but in the end, you kind of have to make it yours, and you have to portray it through your own voice. Otherwise, it's not really that interesting. I think. For example, if I played Falsetas by Moraito or Paco de Lucia or Vicente Amigo, uh, the older I get, the more I realize that I'm never gonna make them sound as good as they do. I mean, Vicente composed those things for his hands, for his guitar, for his way of playing, for his band. Uh, it just I can't compete with that. Same with Paco, and even if technically you have the same faculties, uh, which I don't, especially with Paco, he was unbelievable. Uh, um, but even if you did, to make them sound as good as they do, it just doesn't happen. So I think as a pedagogical tool or step, it's a great idea to play somebody else's music for sure, and to try to get as close to what they do as you can for sure. But once you get to a certain degree, um, I think you absolutely have to come up with your own stuff in flamenco. Otherwise, it kind of starts to sound like classical guitar. Actually, if you play a program of I'm going to play a program of all of these composers and stuff like that, and you just play their music, there's something lacking about that. I don't really know how to express that, but as a flamenco player, when I hear concerts like that, which I don't do very often, but when I do, there's something that's not quite right about it, in my ears anyway. Uh, I much would rather hear something simpler or something less, I'll say evolved, even though that's not the right word. That's unique to that person rather than just somebody else's stuff. That's just my opinion, though, and that's kind of how I see it. That's how I approach composition of flamenco guitar pieces. Um, anyway, that was a long speech to say three things. Um, yeah, exactly. Interpreter versus artist. That's kind of what I'm getting at. In classical music, it's a little bit different because the role of the interpreter does sort of take on a different facet, right? You're finding new stuff in the music. The composers also nowadays give you so much information on the score that that there's 50 different takes of the same piece of music, right? You can do it 50 different ways, and that's the beauty of it. But if flamenco guitar, who's gonna play Almoraima better than Paco Lucia? Who's gonna play Fuente Cadal better than Paco Lucia? No one. I mean, just no one. Even I'm sure even the top guitarists would agree with that. So that's my 2 cents on that subject. Um, anyway, maybe it's a good place to stop. I don't know, Corey. Is there anything else that I should address? Any other questions in the chat that I could see here? I'm sure at this point you're definitely sick of my voice. I don't have a very good speaking voice. Anyway, it's been a pleasure. Yeah, unless I see more questions in the chat, I think that's a good place to leave it at. Hopefully, I didn't repeat too much of what Ricardo said already. I saw he was making some really great points and sharing some really cool things. So hopefully, I did. I talked about other things in general. I don't see anything in the chat. I think that should be good. Anyway, if there's other questions or things that come up that we didn't talk about right now, yeah, exactly. We can be in touch via email or whatnot. I think that'll make it so that you can take home all this information and think about it yourself. And then if there's a follow up, maybe we could even do another one of these at some point. I'd be happy to do that. So anyway, thanks for being here today. That was a pleasure. See you next time. If you have questions, yeah, absolutely, get a hold of me or Corey, and he can put you in contact with me. And until next time, come to California. Yes, absolutely. That's also pending. Hopefully, once things fully normalize after the pandemic, we can do that. Okay, we'll be in touch. Thanks for listening. See you next time.